August of 1958 in Humboldt County was less a heat wave and more an endurance test. The dust was thick enough to chew on, settling into every crease of your clothes and lining the back of your throat with a gritty film that no amount of cheap coffee could wash out. We were running the 99T road cut deep into the King Range, miles past the last sign of paved civilization, essentially carving a shelf into the side of a massive redwood canyon so the logging outfits could get their trucks in. Big Jim, our foreman, always smelled faintly of stale Rainier and sweat, his face perpetually sunburned to the color of dried beef. He was more worried about hitting the daily yardage quota than any of the strange things we occasionally joked about. Red, the oiler, was jumpy even on a good day, but lately, the way he kept glancing up at the tree-lean, chain-smoking camels felt less like nerves and more like expectation. Me? I just kept my head down, driving the Cat D8, listening to the monotonous rumble of the diesel, trying to drown out the ringing in my ears from the morning blasts. The only real sound out here was us. That was the unsettling part. After a big shot went off, a clean, deafening crack that made the air wobble, the ensuing silence wasn't the usual restorative quiet of the woods. It was a vacuum. No birdsong, no cicadas, just the low metallic groan of the cooling equipment and the sound of your own heart hammering against your ribs. The local Shasta tribe had legends about this area, old men whispering about things that walked upright, creatures that preferred the cold shadows of the canyons. But we were tough, pragmatic men. We called it canyon fever and drank more coffee. The exhaustion tasted like pennies on the back of my tongue. It was mid-afternoon, the sun high enough to bake the blood pressure right out of you. We were using the loader to clear the final few tons of a major rock slide near what the surveyors marked as Old Miner's Notch, a completely forgotten seam of low-grade manganese. Mike was wrestling the bucket when he suddenly slammed the hydraulics shut, freezing the machine dead. The abrupt quiet was shocking. Jim yelled, "What the hell, Mike? We ain't on break." But Mike didn't look back. He just pointed the steel tooth of the bucket towards the newly revealed space behind where the landslide had rested for maybe 50 years. It wasn't just bedrock. The impact of the slide had cracked the facing, exposing a man-made structure underneath, a narrow, low entrance cut, maybe 6 feet high, shored up with old, dark timber and sealed off by what looked like an iron grate, rusty and twisted. The air that leaked out of that hole didn't smell like earth or manganese. It smelled like wet, deep cold, ozone, and something else, something sharp and utterly wrong, like old meat left in a cellar. And the grate wasn't just sealed. It looked like something had tried to pull it open from the inside. The steel bars were bowed outward, snapped clean at the welds. The steel bars were bowed outward, snapped clean at the welds. That realization, the sheer, impossible force needed to achieve that, sank into us slowly, thicker than the dust settling after we'd stopped the grater. Doc, the foreman, a man who swore he'd seen everything that California dirt could vomit up, traced the brake with a trembling fingertip. "It's cold," he whispered, pulling his hand back as if burned. "Not outside temperature cold, Pete. Deep cold." The smell intensified, the ozone sharp and biting, overlaying that foul, sweet odor of cellar meat and decay. It wasn't just temperature. The cold radiating from that pit felt like a physical pressure against my chest, draining the heat right out of my leather jacket. We had been working in 70-degree heat, sun beating down, flies buzzing their usual idiot symphony. Now, standing near that twisted entrance, the surrounding woods fell absolutely silent. The high, irritating whine of the cicadas, the sound that defines a hot California noon, just cut out. It was instantaneous, like a switch being thrown. The silence was heavier than any noise could be. It pressed down on my eardrums, causing a faint, dizzying distortion in the air pressure, like a poorly adjusted phonograph. I felt the fine hairs on my arms rise, not from chill, but from an instinctual alarm bell. "What the hell?" whispered Gus, the kid with the newly issued shovel, his eyes darting frantically toward the high, dense line of pines flanking the canyon. He didn't reach for his shovel. He reached for the rusted bolt-action rifle he kept slung across his back, standard equipment out here, mainly for coyotes. That's when the sound came. It didn't come from the woods. It came from deep inside the shaft, behind the mangled grate. It was a single, heavy thud, It had the resonance of something vast hitting a stone floor, not a rock fall, but an object, organic and heavy. A moment of silence followed, thick and choking. Then, a slow, scraping sound. Drag. Scratch. It was wet, like hardened nails raking across damp limestone, moving slowly, deliberately, somewhere in the absolute dark below. Doc snatched up his pickaxe, the muscles in his forearms tightening. Just the settling ground, he rasped, his voice strained, too high. Expansion and contraction. Old timbers shifting under the humidity. That mine hasn't been secure in 50 years, Pete. He was trying to sound authoritative, but his eyes were glued to the black void behind the grate. He was rationalizing, but the sound didn't sound like natural decay. It sounded like something moving with intention. The grating noise stopped the second Doc spoke. The silence returned, now laced with expectation. We stood there, 6 grown men, road crew tough, listening to nothing but our own labored breathing. Then, from the brush line maybe 30 feet away, where the pine started, a place where nothing should have been, a small, dark rock, flat and heavy, rolled out onto the dusty track. It didn't bounce down the slope. It rolled with momentum, exactly as if it had been casually nudged or kicked aside. And with that small, unsettling movement, the air filled with the powerful, immediate stench of wet, hot musk. It was the rank, ammoniac odor of an animal, but impossibly large and incredibly close. We were definitely not alone anymore. We didn't talk about the rock or the smell on the drive back down the mountain. We just breathed through our mouths, the taste of gasoline and exhaust preferable to the residual funk clinging to the cab of the Ford. The thing was, the odor followed us. It settled over the small collection of trailers we called camp, just 3 beat-up aluminum boxes near the creek, 20 miles from the nearest paved highway. The silence that night was a heavy thing. Usually, you heard the creek rushing or the sound of the wind picking up through the pines. But that night, it was a profound, suffocating stillness, broken only by the sound of our own hearts slamming against our ribs. We tried to sleep. Billy, Pete, and I were crammed into the smallest trailer. By 2 a.m., the air inside was thick with stale breath and sweat, but none of us would risk opening a window. That's when the sounds started in earnest. They weren't distant snaps anymore. They were right outside. The first sound was a dull, wet thud against the aluminum wall, like a sack of damp grain being dropped. Then came the pacing. Not walking, but pacing. Slow, heavy steps that compressed the dry earth outside our door. Thump, thump, thump. The sound had weight. It sounded like something impossibly massive moving with unnerving care, mapping out the perimeter of our tiny, fragile shelter. The pacing lasted nearly an hour, and then came the scratching. It started low, a dry, hesitant scrape, but it grew bolder, transforming into a ragged, repetitive SCCCCHHHHHH right beside Pete's head, where the trailer's flimsy wood paneling was thinnest. It wasn't claws on metal. It was something harder, denser, perhaps stone or bone, being methodically dragged against the wood frame. I tasted pure iron in my throat, the metallic precursor to panic. We started fighting the next morning. Small, sharp arguments over who left the tools out, or who used the last of the coffee. The camaraderie was gone, replaced by a raw, irritable tension fueled by 4 consecutive nights of zero sleep. We looked like ghosts, our eyes sunk in deep, red hollows. The worst part was the way we would catch each other staring, not at each other, but slightly past each other, fixated on some imaginary point in the woods behind. We were checking if the other person was seeing it too. Pete, though, became the worst. He stopped arguing. He stopped sleeping. By the 5th night, he was manic. He started carrying his hunting knife tucked into his waistband, even when he was driving the grader. When the pacing started that night, I watched him sit straight up in his bunk, rigid, not out of fear, but intense focus. The scratching began again, and Pete started to whisper. They weren't coherent words, just low, guttural sounds, resonant and strange, directed toward the wall. When I asked him what he was doing, he didn't even look at me. He kept his eyes locked on the spot where the scratching sound was coming from. It's talking, he breathed, the words barely audible. It's got a rhythm. I just need to figure out what it wants. The next night, I woke up to find Pete standing outside the trailer, shivering in the cold, smears of reddish creek mud mixed with something slicker, spit, perhaps all over the doorframe. Abandoning the entire job, Pete had crossed some line, and I feared whatever was outside was already living inside his head. I didn't sleep a wink. The cheap nylon cot scratched my neck, and the smell of pine sol and old wood oil did nothing to mask the underlying odor of wet soil that clung to everything Pete had touched. I waited for the first gray light to touch the window pane. I knew Pete was gone, or at least the Pete I knew was. He was huddled in the corner of his bunk, holding the grease gun like a crucifix. At 5:15 a.m., I told him we were pulling the crew out. We'd leave the grader, leave the cat. We were just taking the pickup and getting down the mountain. He didn't answer. He just stared at the wall, a slight smile twitching on his lips. I left him there. The air outside was razor-sharp and cold, but it didn't feel cleansing. It felt heavy, like breathing dust mixed with iron. I headed toward the staging area where we'd parked the diesel pickup. I rounded the edge of the fuel drum, kicking up a spray of ice chips. The first thing I registered wasn't the silence, but the sheer, geometric wrongness of the scene. The equipment wasn't just dusty or dirty. Our brand new road grader, the one that cost us half a year's profit, was overturned. Not slid, not tipped by unstable ground. It was flipped. The heavy steel plow blade was bent upwards, twisted like soft aluminum foil. And across the entire yellow chassis, running from the cab to the rear differential, were parallel gouges, deep, wet scars in the paint and the underlying metal. Whatever made those marks didn't use a tool. It used pure, ripping strength. A low, throaty sound, not a growl but an involuntary expulsion of breath, hit me from the tree-line about 50 yards away. It wasn't the sound of an animal seeking food. It was the sound of something watching, something that knew it had already won. My feet locked. My hands were instantly clammy. I could taste the copper in my own saliva. I was facing the shredded metal, trying to process the impossibility of the physics before me, but my peripheral vision caught the movement. Not a deer, not a bear. This thing was too tall, too black, absorbing the weak morning light. It stepped into the margin between the pines and the clearing. I didn't see details, just mass, a solid, shifting wall of muscle and shadow, draped in long, matted fur the color of wet cinder. The scale of it was grotesque, easily 10 feet tall, its shoulders sloping forward. It moved with an impossible, silent fluidness, completely disproportionate to its weight. Then it stopped. It didn't look at me with curiosity. It looked with a cold, absolute certainty, like a child looking at an insect it was about to crush. Its chest heaved once, and the smell hit me, a wave of stale ammonia and hot, unwashed hide so strong it made my eyes water and my stomach churn. I finally understood Pete's silence and the meaning of his offering. We weren't building a road through the wilderness. We had broken into something's house, and the landlord had come to collect the rent. The primal terror of knowing your species is not the apex predator snapped my mind like cheap timber. I finally broke free, stumbling backward, not running, just desperate to reverse the last 10 seconds, realizing that Pete wasn't inviting it in. He was trying to buy us time, and we were out of change. The silence after Pete dropped the shovel was thicker than the mountain fog, only broken by a sickening, wet thwack as something heavy impacted the metal lantern case. I didn't see it happen, but the sound confirmed everything. Pete's wheezing gasp cut short, replaced by a dull, fleshy tearing sound that echoed unnaturally loud in the cold air. I didn't look back. I just ran, pure panic dissolving the fear into a corrosive, bitter acid in my throat. I yanked the passenger door open, scrambling over the transmission hump, hitting the cab floor before clawing my way into the driver's seat. Mac, keys. Go. Mac, pale and slack-jawed, fumbled the keys into the ignition. He turned the key. RRRRRRRR. Nothing. Just the tired whine of the starter motor battling the cold engine block. Choke it, you idiot. Choke it. I yelled, shoving his hand toward the dash knob. We heard the noise then, closer now. Not steps. Something heavy dragging, pulling itself through the brush, snapping saplings like celery sticks. The smell of wet dog and something ancient, like peat moss and stale copper, slammed into the cab, thick enough to taste. Mac tried again. RRRRRRRR. The engine coughed once, spat a weak plume of white smoke, and died. It's coming around the side, Mac whimpered, pointing a shaky finger at the passenger window. Through the dirty glass, I saw a shadow, not a normal shadow, but a shifting, muscular distortion that dwarfed the high pines lining the cut. The whole cab dipped slightly as something impossibly heavy leaned against the fender, testing the metal. It was waiting for us. I grabbed the ignition, wrenching the key hard, not caring if the old motor seized. RRRVLM. The engine caught, roaring to life, shaking the old Ford like a tremor. The sound felt like a violation of the deep quiet, a desperate scream of combustion. Reverse. Hard reverse. I screamed. Mac didn't need telling twice. He slammed the gearshift into reverse and floored the gas. The truck lurched backward, spinning gravel, the tires clawing for traction against the loose dirt. For one horrifying second, I looked out the driver's side mirror. That thing, it wasn't fast, but it was relentless. It was standing where Pete had been, not looking at us, but down. And clutched in its massive, wet hand, was a piece of fabric, dark and shredded, that I instantly recognized as the sleeve of Pete's denim jacket. The sound of the engine was deafening, but it wasn't enough. We were backing up blind, praying the road behind us was clear, but the creature was gaining, its form now illuminated by the weak taillights. It let out a sound, not a roar, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the truck's frame, sinking into my teeth. It was a sound of ownership, of territory reclaimed. Hold on, I screamed, realizing the truck was veering toward the steep shoulder. I wrestled the wheel, correcting sharply, the cold sweat pooling under my collar. We flew backward past the makeshift camp, past the overturned barrels, leaving everything behind. The equipment, the maps, the horrifying, absolute silence of the forest closing its jaws behind us. We were free of the cut, yes, but now we were driving into the endless night, and the fear was no longer about being caught. It was about knowing what was now stalking the state of California, and that we had been the ones to wake it up. We were free of the cut, yes, but now we were driving into the endless night, and the fear was no longer about being caught. It was about knowing what was now stalking the state of California, and that we had been the ones to wake it up. We kept the gas pedal pinned, the roar of the truck a desperate, ragged sound that barely managed to drown out the memory of that wet, sucking tear of fabric and muscle from moments before. We didn't stop until the early, acidic light of dawn started to bleach the sky over Redding, painting the civilization we sought in colors too bright and violent. Only 3 of us were left to stagger into the sheriff's station, myself, Jensen, and Old Man Miller. Miller had broken somewhere past the 3rd county line. He didn't scream or cry. He just started humming a hymn we used to sing in Sunday school, eyes vacant, staring fixedly at the grime on the windshield. The authorities were exactly as useless as you'd expect. They saw 3 men smelling of adrenaline and stale sweat, raving about something impossibly tall and reeking of sulfur and wet earth. They listened to our fragmented, panicked confession with the polite, weary patience of men who deal with mental breaks every tax season. They wrote us up for abandoning state property. They said the camp had signs of heavy bear activity, maybe a mountain lion, nothing that couldn't be explained by poor preparation and mass hysteria fueled by exhaustion. When we insisted on the size, the sound, the absolute wrongness of it all, they just nodded, told us to get some rest, and quietly suggested counseling. There was nothing left to investigate. The forest had swallowed the evidence. Miller was institutionalized 2 weeks later. He stopped eating solid food, claiming the texture was wrong, too grainy, like pulverized bone. He spent his final weeks trying to tear the hair from his arms, screaming that the skin was stretching, pulling taut over something thick and black beneath. He died of complications stemming from self-mutilation. Jensen tried to adapt. He took a job-clearing brush near Santa Cruz, but he started leaving raw meat out every night, believing he had to pay tribute to the thing, keep it fed so it wouldn't follow. He disappeared 6 months ago. No note, just an open back door and the persistent smell of pine needles tracked through the house. I am the last one. I live now in the flatlands, surrounded by concrete and the cacophony of the city, where I can hear the noise of human traffic at all times. I only work jobs indoors, never near dirt or trees. But the silence still finds me. I know they closed the file, and they reopened the road cut with a fresh crew who knew nothing of the whispers in the dark. They treated it like a ghost story, a regional myth from some drunk lumberjacks. But I know what we woke up. It wasn't a legend. It was a predator, patient and aimed our civilization to dig another shallow grave for itself. And I know, with chilling certainty, that it didn't stay in those woods. It's closer now.